we thought we'd start it off by having me give an introductory talk a little bit about Project WiCCED for those who don't know about it, then also talk about these blueprints for policy design and programs. And then hopefully you'll join us back for the third Wednesday of the month around 11 o'clock. We will also have the series where you'll hear from a number of different participants in the Project WiCCED team and hear about their work. Now, one of the things that we're really excited about with this whole program is the idea that we can focus some attention on the great work that is being done by our students. And so we thought we'd have a sort of an opening act, a short talk by one of the students involved with the project, and then we'll pass it back on, and I'll be sort of the closer to it and talk a little bit about the main topics. So we are really blessed today to have Rachel King here with us today, and she's been working a lot with two key faculty members associated with Project WiCCED, Leah Palm-Forrester and Amy Schober. So I'm going to pass it on over to Rachel to talk about what her work has been and how she's been connected. So Rachel, go ahead.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel. So I'm a current grad student at UD, and as an undergrad, I worked with Project WiCCED with Dr. Leah Palm-Forrester and Dr. Amy Schober. We explored the poultry industry in Delmarva, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, specifically looking into the distribution of poultry litter. Poultry litter is a byproduct from chicken production. In other words, it's poop. Chicken litter is an abundant source of nutrients that is extremely beneficial to crops, leading many farmers to utilize the manure to fertilize their crops. Due to its high nutrient levels, applying too much manure in concentrated areas can cause detrimental effects on local watershed through runoff and nutrient overload. The goal of my research is to identify how we can cost-effectively move manure from high nutrient areas to low nutrient areas where it's needed. This project initially received funding from the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture through the Critical Agriculture Resource and Extension, also known as the CARE program. Additional funds from Project WiCCED allowed us to expand the scope of this project. The funding enabled us to work with the National Agricultural Statistics Service, NASS, to conduct a survey of crop producers in addition to the surveys we distributed for manure brokers and poultry growers. A project through UD's Office of Economic Innovation and Partnership Spin-In program is creating a prototype platform where crop growers, manure brokers, and poultry producers can come together to connect the people who have chicken litter to the people who want it.
Well, thank you, Rachel. We really appreciate that work. Obviously, we know one of the biggest challenges of coastal water in Delaware is the over-nutrients of water. And so trying to find a good economic value for that nutrients to get it where it needs to go and get it to the people who can grow important food in our state is really critical. And we appreciate your work that you're doing with Leah and Amy and their work. And it's exciting to see the economic development potential working with Spin-In and OEIP in that. So I think it's a great example of the type of work that that Project WiCCED's been about. And thank you, Rachel, for your commitment and effort to this. So if we go on to my general talk, I want to talk a little bit about just what Project WiCCED's all about for those who are familiar with it. Touch briefly on it. We can talk more about it. I know a lot of people are already familiar. And then hit on issues around key things that happen when we're trying to look at solutions-based approaches to coastal water challenges. The last mile problem, almost in some ways exemplified by Rachel there, right? You know the problem of having too much nutrients. Now, how do you get that manure to that last mile of where someone wants it versus where it's considered waste? Talk about why we want to do evidence-based policy and policy blueprints and what that really means. Talk about academia's loading dock problem and how we're trying to solve that here in Project WiCCED. And throughout this entire talk, I'll try to illustrate these key issues by highlighting recent work that's been funded either through Project WiCCED or Delaware's EBSCOR program more broadly, and give a sense of what we're doing. So you'll see lots of different talks with lots of different people involved, but hopefully it'll give you a flavor of what we're doing. Importantly, a good reason why it works importantly, both academically, but also for societal purposes. So as an introduction to coastal water challenges in Delaware, probably is not something we need to talk a lot about, but because we see this all the time in the news. This is just an example of the last 2 years of looking at the news journals' lead stories about the challenges that have happened with groundwater, with various contaminants, with various saltwater intrusion. And it's something that continually arises. We have flooding that's been happening on the coastal areas and inland. Over and over again, Delaware residents are faced with water challenges. And so this can be broadly considered water security, both quality challenges and quantity challenges at various points. And that is what we wanted to look at in this project, recognizing that not only is Delaware facing these issues and our region broadly, but really these are broad issues facing humanity, right? If 40% of the world's population is living within 100 kilometers of coasts, then these challenges are very real to the whole entire global population. And knowing that these coastal areas are also undergoing stress with a changing climate. So let's begin to dig down deep in a small incubator lab that's Delaware, where we can work with academia, nonprofits, government sector, businesses, and try to come up with some strong solutions and understandings of this whole process. And that's what we've been doing with Project WiCCED. And WiCCED stands for Water in the Changing Coastal Environment of Delaware. It's been a significant investment from the National Science Foundation and the state of Delaware, and a project that started back in October of 2018. So we're just really wrapping up year 2. So we welcome people's feedback on how things are going and where we should be going next. We've first got lots of great plans going forward. But generally, if we're looking at things, we're looking at understanding these threats of this nutrients in the waters and the salinization that can happen, and the impacts on natural environments and human environments as well, and ultimately to develop some solutions and early warning systems and other types of approaches that can help us be more sustainable in this environment. And we can see with this picture here, just the large amounts of problems that were highlighted in those news articles earlier, just the challenges throughout our state when it comes to water and its impairments. These are the structural features of Project WiCCED that we like to talk about. And so we think about the threat assessments. This is a lot of focus on the natural sciences to understand what's happening in the natural world. How is this all playing out? And what I'll be talking more about is the solution development. How do we begin to take that knowledge and begin to tackle it? And how do we work through behavior and markets and policy? How do we train a workforce and even come up with economic development opportunities to come from that, like Rachel was just talking about, so that we can begin to really develop the tools and systems that we need and the policies to begin to make a informed solution-based approach. Now, one of the great things about Project WiCCED is that we invest a lot in students, a diverse group of students that's very inclusive, and we want to have that educational piece part of it, not only for educating the current students of today, but these are the workforce of tomorrow that we're excited to be engaged in this project. And so having strong partnerships and engaging with students is really important. And finally, we have a enabling cores, really critical scientific and technical know-how around data and sensors and the microbiome that help inform all this project. So again, I'll be focusing mostly on solution development and social dimensions. Some of the later talks in the seminar series will dive into these other threats and cores and so forth. So a lot to going on here. So let's talk a moment about the last mile problem. Again, Rachel gave a good example of of what that is. It's the idea we kind of know that we want to get from one place to another. How do we get there, right? And this is a challenge that we see, throughout, the business sector and others saying, okay, we're trying to deliver something that becomes more expensive, actually get people to do this. Vaccines are a common situation where, so if we come up with a vaccine for COVID-19 that really is very effective, how do we cross that last mile? How do we get everyone vaccinated, right? How do we overcome people's resistance to doing it, their inertia of not doing it, their fear or whatever? This is something that is common where we can come up with solutions, and therefore we need blue, right, that help develop it. What's the right way of approaching this? Because there's often lots of ideas about how to bridge this last mile, but we don't have strong evidence on it. We don't bring that natural science method of understanding the threats necessarily to thinking about how do we implement the solutions. And that's something that we're really focused in on, is let's come up with good ways of testing delivery of key elements that will help us get to our ultimate solution. And let's find the way to build this forward using the scientific approach and using evidence behind it. So, that is something that we've been very focused in on. And, it is interesting to note that our project at Project WiCCED is considerably different than a lot of other projects. And this is an interesting article that just came out earlier this summer talking about when it comes around to funding for behavioral research related to climate change, there's very little of it. They looked at around, $1.3 trillion of donations from grants, over 4.3 million awards. And what they found is that very little money is going into behavioral change research. And yet, if we think about climate change, this is ultimately about human behavior, right? Human behavior is how we got into this situation generally in the first place. So getting out of that is going to require some changes of human behavior, and that adaptation and mitigation is going to be critically there. But we haven't seen the funding go there. And so this is an opportunity to really show how to leverage natural science know-how and understanding the threats with solutions and to work together to come forward there. And so, again, this is kind of an imbalance that's happening in funding, and there's kind of a call to see more of this happen and go forward. And hopefully we can see this is not only happening at the granting agencies, but also at federal policies. It's interesting to look back. There's an evidence-based policy-making commission act that happened back in 2016 when Obama was president. It was bipartisan. It was a big initiative of Paul Ryan, who was Speaker in the House at that time. And they released a report after Obama signed it in 2017. And then it actually got put into place by the Trump administration. In fact, in January of just last year, that began to happen. And now all federal agencies are supposed to be applying policies and programs that encourage evidence-based policies going forward, whether USDA or education or in health. And this kind of approach, is going to be continue to be looked at for both policies at the federal level, but local level, nonprofits, and so forth. And so, in many ways, what we're doing here in Project WiCCED is very, in sync with that broader push that's happening at many different levels. And let me tell you why. Let me give you an example why we would think this is important, because so much of the time when it comes around to policies, we kind of a good title of something, we have a good idea that makes a lot of sense from the heart's perspective, but we often don't know whether it works. And let's think about juvenile crime for a moment. You might be familiar with the idea of a scared straight program. You've got some juvenile delinquents, let's have an intervention with them, right? So it's intervention, take them to a prison where they'll see some serious criminals who've spent their entire life in jail. And they'll hear about how horrible this experience has been. And you'll hear about, they'll say, this is the time to get, straight, guys. Get scary straight. Don't commit crimes when you're adults, where you're going to be in this prison for a long time. And the early studies suggested this was really impressive. They looked at people who had participated in the program, and sure enough, their likelihood of committing crime later in adulthood decreased. And so lots of money went into these kind of scared straight programs to bring juvenile delinquents into prisons to scare them straight. However, what they weren't doing was really looking at a counterfactual. What if people hadn't gone into the scared straight program? What would have happened? And if you know much about juvenile crime, you'll find that actually people age out of it in some ways, right? Not perfectly, unfortunately, but there's a lot of people who are in the juveniles who just, without even going to the scared straight program, will not commit crime later on. So just using a before and after technique is not a good measurement of whether scared straight is working. You'd really want to have the same kind of kids, half of them randomly selected, got to go participate in scared straight, the other half didn't, and then see about their outcomes. And when they started doing these larger studies that were carefully designed, they found out a very problematic thing, which was the participants in scared straight actually increased their crime relative to that control group. And that means that we've been spending all of this money to get programs, intervention to stop crime, and we're actually increasing crime at a high cost, right? We're actually spending money to do that. Now, you start asking questions, why, right? And that's an interesting question. You could explore that more with research. Perhaps people had already anticipated that it was really bad. Maybe there was something that about going to these prisons that was normalizing, or something like that was there, but we certainly wouldn't want to be investing lots of public resources into a program that shows no results and perhaps counter results. And so this is the kind of thing that we need to begin to think about when our programs are being developed, is do we develop a control group to see what it's like with and without the program? And that's something that we haven't done very much, but it's something that we've been doing here in Project WiCCED. And let me show you an example. So working with Kelly Davidson, Brandon McFadden, and a graduate student, Melissa Langer, we looked at, how do we market Delaware's oysters better, right? And many of us know that these oysters are new to Delaware, and they're really promising, not only as an economic product, but also something that cleans up the waters of the inland bays and brings pride to our state. It's a lot of good things that are happening there. And so we've been working on a number of projects on oysters. And one of the ideas is, with the idea of social media coming forward, we could really begin to tell consumers very niche stories about how their friends like these products, right? And how they enjoy the consumption of them, how they're willing to pay for it. And we can think that we know that we like kind of peer information, if it's like TripAdvisor or Yelp or Amazon ratings. These may be helping guide our consumer purchases. And so could this help Delaware Oysters? Well, we put it to a test. Instead, let's give people pure information. Let's have people make actual decisions on actual oysters that they were eating right away. Let's have them in groups of peers and groups of strangers and provide that information to them. Well, what we found is that, the literature is out there talking about peer effects being possibly really good. Most of these have been done with hypothetical surveys. We're making hypothetical choices or low-powered studies without much sample size. But we went and said, let's get a properly powered, over 1,000 consumers. Let's have, people making actual choices with actual products, with actual feedback, with people that they can see and know. And the results were shocking, right? This actually decreases people's willingness to pay. When I find out that Amy Slocum doesn't like having oysters, well, that may influence me to avoid them as well. And this shows to be not an effective way of especially marketing a new product, something that a lot of people don't have a lot of familiarity with being Delaware Oysters, that this type of situation doesn't do it. Now you might say, Kent, that's a failed study, right? Boy, you just showed a study that you thought was going to be great, and you say, boy, it's a failure. You've been wasting money. It's like, no, I'd say opposite. I feel very confident that we've got 1,000 people. We were able to look for really important, economically significant and statistically significant effects, and they weren't there. Actually, they were the opposite direction. In fact, look at the publication bias. This is something that we would actually expect to see, is where there's kind of an error in this type of approach, where we only publish stuff that's exciting and new and significant. Here's something that's actually contrary, and this is good science to be done and important. So we don't invest money in this type of marketing. We know which parts that we can look at new ways of doing it. Maybe it's on local foods, or maybe there's other ways in which we can promote this as good for the water or other things. We're not going to be spending money and time trying this route. So this is the type of blueprinting that we're hoping to do, to show policymakers, programs, what works, and importantly, what doesn't work. And that's really critically important in this process. We've also been looking at doing this in the context of another coastal challenge, which is preventing floods, and working with Asana Zuzaman and Kevin Brinson and Dan Leathers, looking at, how could we begin to do better road signages to prevent drownings. And this is something that happens in coastal areas or just any inland areas about, when a road is closed, do people believe it? And what if that road's been washed out when that flood happens? And we know it's a significant impact for death every year. And so we had a study involving over 700 people, and we gave them a variety of different signs. We didn't really know what was the right way to do it. We could provide no information. They could just think that there's a possibility of there being a flood or control. We could give them a standard road flooded sign, or we could give them some new kind of next generation signs that perhaps are built out with specific measurements or levels of water that are there. And we could compare how would that impact people's driving behavior. And we did it as a survey first. We could ultimately do this on the roads. And we found really interesting results, right? And we found that, compared to a base category, that showing something's less than 4 inches, giving them that information, actually means they drive through the water even more. They're more willing to say, that's fine. I'm okay with that, even though, that is a level that could still move a car if the water's swift enough. But giving them signs like it's over 12 inches or this amount of 3 lines, squiggly lines, it really makes an impact. So be careful about it. You might just go with the road closed unless you can really show it's a highly flooded one. This type of information could be really valuable. And we've had discussions with DelDOT and others about what types of signage we could use to help prevent that. And again, use evidence-based, because it's not entirely clear if it's information about symbols or numbers that would drive it. But we can learn and we can improve and have good blueprints for all of this. Another key situation is to look at the cost effectiveness of approaches, and many people are familiar with the Southbridge community in South Wilmington and understanding all that's large legacy contamination in the past, and the fact that as a coast, being relatively close to the coast and being along the Delaware River, it's also highly susceptible to flooding because it's so low lying. And so working with Mike Kaczynski and Caitlin Ritchie, who was a graduate student here, we went into the community of Southbridge, in fact, into the homes of people in Southbridge, and with their permission and with them directly tested the water of their homes, because one of the concerns that this community had was that their water was not safe, even though it came from the Brandywine River and it came through like the same thing that the rest said, and there was no public reports of it. The local people were very concerned about it, feeling very, systematically disadvantaged as a community and so forth. And so we said, well, let's go ahead and test that water for you, and let's test it for its safety. We'll use a professional lab test, and we'll use kind of a home test kit. And then we'll come back and give you those results, and then see how you feel about it. And then the question was, would they drink this water or not? And it was all voluntary. It's all IRB approved. And the thing that we found here, yes, people really cared about finding out that their water from their house and their taps was safe, right? That really mattered to them. And that's important in a community like that, because, these are low-income people. They don't need to be buying bottled water unless it's really for their safety. Shouldn't be spending extra money to do that if the water is safe to begin with. And the key thing is, if we look at the results there, that level of concern drops in half for either the water test kit or the professional lab kit. Well, that's great news. Great news to make people feel better about the water they're consuming. But we can imagine that this also has big economic impacts from a blueprint perspective for policy, because these water test kits are dramatically cheaper than the professional lab tests. And so we should still be doing professional lab tests to make sure that those things are going well. But if there's a reliable home remedy as well that can come at a couple dollars versus much higher than that, then that's very valuable. Good way of getting lots of tests for people to feel better about their water. And so it's a cost-effective approach too. So we can not only say, is it effective, but what's the cost there? And so again, a really important way to then communicate out that if we're trying to deal with this at a policy level, here's effective approaches to do. And so those were very positive things. As we continue to think about interesting coastal questions that Project WiCCED's engaged in, I like to highlight the work that Sean Ellis and Tracy Liberty and one of our undergraduates, Faith Brown's, been doing on cover crops. This is an important nutrient reduction process by planting a crop in the winter. And we can see that Delaware is actually in the hotbed of cover crop usage. And it's something that is continuing to grow. There's a lot of focus on it. We said, well, let's do an understanding. How much do policymakers even know about this issue? And increasingly, the persistence. Do farmers use it year after year after year? In which is going to be important for sustainability to keep this practice going and to make sure that we are making the progress that we want to see. All right, just doing it 1 year isn't all that great. This might not have the long-term coastal water benefits that we're hoping for. And so we said, let's talk to a bunch of ag professionals, see what they say about whether this practice will persist year after year and farmers will use it. Well, the first thing we learned was there was no consensus about it. There was a sense that maybe say 200 fields used it in 1 year. The next year, only 100 of those fields, about half of those fields, would still be using it a year later. But some people said it'd be 20%, maybe 82%. Some had high senses of persistence, and yet what we were able to find is actually that persistence. If we looked at the data that was planned in 2015, this was a collaboration with DENREC, where they have this dashboard data. They go out every winter and check out in the fields whether people are actually planting these things or not. They go out and look physically on it. We could see that of the crops planted in 2015, 1 year later, only about 40% were still doing that. And then it continued to drop in year 2 and 3. And so this looks very bad news, right? The people who are trying it one time are not staying with it. And that could be a really disheartening process. And how do we improve that? And so we ask people, why doesn't it happen? Well, one idea is, there's just not enough money, right? They just can't, it's not enough money, or maybe it doesn't help soil health as much as people think it's going to help. Or, perhaps there's some other, technical aspects to this. It's more complicated to plant and harvest and do this during other times that are as busy. There's lots of hypotheses that were out there. And again, if you're trying to come up with a good program and that encourages cover crop usage over time, you want to focus on the real issue, right? And so, one of the great things that Sean was able to do, and Tracy and her team, was to look at, a Markov process and begin to tease out the fact that what key aspects for cover crop usage was crop rotation, right? The fact that you don't grow the same crop every year on the same piece of land. You might sometimes have corn, you might have soybeans, you might do double soybeans. There might be other products that you're going to be growing on the same field over time. And some of those crop rotations won't work well for cover crops, right? They're harvested too late. You can't get the cover crop into the winter. But it doesn't mean that once you're back into a more, a cycle of a crop rotation that does work well with cover crops, such as just a planting of corn, that people don't go back to it. In fact, when we looked at that, when we held into account the cover crop issue, we found that the persistence was actually much higher, 70 to 80%. Over time. So this was a good news that people, yes, they might decrease in one year, but that's because of a crop rotation. And when the rotation continues, they'll actually pick it up again. Now, you still might say, hey, I still want to see them year after year after year. Well, that may be a good idea, but at least we have to know what we're fighting against, right? It's not just people don't know it or they don't have the money. It's not the crop rotation. It's a structural thing, at least for, that we'd have to begin to deal with. And that's an important understanding of the entire process. So again, key elements that help guide evidence-based policy that can help us achieve these goals. Now, I love to take time to go through all these different projects and go through all the various aspects, but there's a couple other ones. I'll just give a quick highlight out to really important work that Palm Forester has been doing with Kevin Brinson and others to look at the Delaware irrigation management system. Again, a great new technique to look at, how can we use precision agriculture to get better nutrient usage by better irrigation, so that we're not putting a lot of nutrients on the field only to have a poorly grown crop, so that there's a lot of excess nutrients that can wash away during high rain events. How can we have more people do it? It's kind of the key question of the last mile problem. You've got this great tool that's been built. The Department of Ag's all in favor of it. It's been really well done, but is it being used by enough farmers? What could be done to make it more accessible to them, make those results better? Again, that last mile problem I talked about, what's that blueprint to get there? That's a project that they're working on and thinking about. Is it about a visualization? Is it about knowledge? What are those elements that are holding it up? And so that's on a farmer use perspective. And then we also have a similar situation that we've been working with collaborators on the new Coastal Observer app. You should check it out with Tina and Jules and Laura. Have all been looking at, how do we get this app to be used more, right? How do you get that citizen science perspective going, where when there's a storm or just unusual conditions, people are making the observations that otherwise couldn't be made? How do we use this kind of as an app that can help inform good decision making and policy? And again, these are situations where we have new technology coming into place, and we're now having people interface with it, but it's always not clear what's the best way to do it. We want to start talking about, make it really clear how the policy implications are of submitting Coastal Observer recordings, right? That people can use these and inform them, just like they've been very valuable in the context of tracking migratory birds through eBird or other things like that. How do we encourage people to do these things so that can help us in the long term? These are exciting projects that we're really excited about that are happening, and again, helping inform a variety of different coastal water challenges that we face in Delaware. Now, my final talk is what Project WiCCED is trying to do with the challenge of academia's loading dock problem. And so now, this is not a case of where we just can't get our beer and it seems to be falling off the truck, right? That would be a problem for most of academia, but it's an illustration about the challenge about how we conduct our science and try to convey it to stakeholders in a meaningful way. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that it often is like this loading truck here, where we think we've got this great deliverable. Maybe this is cases of kegs of beer that we think that everyone should really be enjoying, and we've got all this great knowledge about programs. But when we actually get to the loading dock, we find out the truck's gone, right? Or the truck never knew there was a delivery. And I think this happens a lot in behavioral science, where we say, well, we got this really important discovery. Now we're trying to tell people about it, but they're like, well, hold on, we don't need that anymore. We've already made our decisions, or we're not interested in that question. And if you'd asked it this way, we would have found this information really helpful. So that's why we need to be engaged with stakeholders when we would do this, and we let people know what the findings are of our results, not only in academic papers, which is going to be clearly important, but also finding ways in which we translate those and make them meaningful for a large audience. And so this is the loading dock problem, and I want to give an example of how we've been trying to deal with that and the outreach efforts. One of the main focuses of early 2020, which feels like a long time ago, was the governor's clean water legislation around the clean water bill. Now, as you may recall, there was a big fanfare around the governor announcing this $50 million annual program that would be investing in clean water. And so there was a lot of excitement about that in early 2020. But of course, we know that the world changed, right? COVID-19 became a focus that we're all still dealing with. And it also meant, is still a priority. Where does clean water focus in when there's so many people struggling, both with fear of their own health or loss of jobs, and all the challenges and changes there. And we thought, we need to engage in this question right now, because they're still considering this bill and what we can do. And so working with Laura Paul, who's a postdoc here in UD, and George Parsons, went out and conducted a survey of 700 Delawareans in the midst of the pandemic shutdown. Now, of course, this is online, so that was all good. But back in May, we went there and said, tell us about what you're experiencing, and tell us to what degree clean water is on your radar screen or not, right? Because in some ways, we can imagine that lots of people were suffering. And in fact, 90% of the people said, yes, they are experiencing personal and financial hardships that were there. But if we think about one thing that happens with COVID-19 is people have been using outdoor recreational amenities more than ever, right? State park usage is up dramatically throughout the state. REI and other places can't keep themselves full of kayaks because people are out there kayaking or paddleboarding, or even walking along creeks. People care about the water perhaps more than ever in the state of Delaware. So maybe, they would still care about it as much as they did before, or even more, because of their personal experience there. And so we wanted to engage in that very moment, that loading dock problem when the state's considering this. And we found out that 3% of the people said that it actually lowered their willingness to pay. COVID-19 had a negative impact on their view of water because they just didn't have the money to do it. In fact, when we said that, the average program was going to cost about $50 a person in the state of Delaware, over 60% of respondents said that, they would be willing to pay upwards of $55 or even higher than that for their household. And so about half of them still increased all of it to $200 there. So a strong sense that that water continued to be a priority despite a global pandemic. And again, this is important research. We published a news journal article on it in the midst of June, or as fast as we could. And we know we got direct response from the state legislature saying that it was really important as we consider these issues. And again, that's evidence-based policy, right? Knowing what the people are thinking. And maybe the results were that people wouldn't care. And that was important to provide as well. But in this case, it was a situation where people did see the value and wanted to continue it. And so helping inform that, great. And we've also been working, I know I jump topics a lot, but this is another important thing that Project WiCCED's been involved with, which is taking these knowledges through blueprints for policy and behavioral science and working at a national level. And as many of you know, USDA administers over $7 million in agro-environmental payments a year through things like the Conservation Reserve Program or the Conservation Stewardship Program. and they were very interested and keen on having us work up training manuals for them that could be used in Delaware and throughout the country to around the 10,000 staff that USDA has at the local level. And so we put these things out last year as training manuals for people to understand, what is it, how do you use experiments to understand what works and what doesn't work and why that's important, so that when you're communicating with landowners about conservation issues, you can bring the best paths forward. So we're excited about this stuff. We're excited that we got 3 more years to work on Project WiCCED. And we're even excited to be able to embody some of these things even in classes. We have a new class with a new faculty member, Christina McGonagran, who is going to be talking about how do we use behavioral science to inform healthy habits and relationships and finance, bring those to personal level as well as policy level, and offer that as a new winter course. So we're trying to hit at policymakers, our students, and throughout this entire process, help embed that human behavioral perspective into the work that we're doing. So I wanted to say thank you. I appreciate your audience today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hey, Ken, this is Malcolm. Yeah, I have a question.
Great.
Yeah, so in all of your studies, and for example, the specific one with the signage, the road signage for the water signs, are these studies being compared to studies that are done in other states, or is it just concentrating only in Delaware?
Malcolm, that's a great question, right? And so it varies, to tell you the truth, on this. This one was something that had participants that were from Delaware and the region. Often when we recruit people to our studies, if we're doing them in person, it's really difficult to just get Delawareans, right? So if we did this at Ag Day or Coast Day, we'll find that our pool of people is majority Delawareans, but there's a large percentage of people that are outside the state. So even the oyster study I'm sure would have people outside the state. Now, when we're doing the clean water, that was specifically Delawareans, right? Because that was a specific legislative issue there, so we only recruited them.
No,
so
but
we try, yeah.
Yeah, what I'm trying to ask is, so these are the signs that you all suggested for Delaware, but I'm sure other states had other sort of signage. So was a comparative study done, to see if, folks in other states prefer a certain signage compared to those in Delaware, or, something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Malcolm. And you're getting at the idea that one of the things that you find with these studies is you need to do more studies, which is probably true with science in general, right? So what works in Delaware, would it work? Maybe it would work in New Jersey or Maryland, but is it going to work for California or someone else down in Texas? And we don't know that answer. So the answer is we don't. We obviously contribute to the literature and look at other studies when we're writing them up. But to do comparisons is something that's kind of beyond it right now, just because there simply has been no other study that we know of that's done this. And so hopefully by moving this forward, what we'd love to do is to, again, demonstrate the idea as a practical idea, then work with, the state or federal level highway administrators to then implement these signs to see where are they most effective. And then we can begin to look at why. But usually there's a scaling up that these studies, like specifically this study, has not yet done.
Hey, Kent, this is Tina Callahan. I just want to follow on to Malcolm's comment or question, and just maybe even the nuance of the coastal flooding and behaviors to coastal flooding versus riverine flooding. I just think that there's a difference in the behaviors of the people, where they live and how they approach water, maybe nuisance flooding or higher water that they're used to on a regular basis. So it might be even an interesting nuance there.
Yeah, and Tina, that's a great point, right? And that's something that we did tease out. I don't have those results in my mind right now, but one of the key things is, in a coastal flooding situation, these could be tidal, right? We know that's in Delaware, some roads that get constantly flooded. And in that case, you actually have more experience around it. You might be very accustomed to that type of flooding. You might feel very comfortable driving through it, and you kind of have a good sense of how bad it is, versus some of the recent flooding along in the state of Delaware, which might have been up on the Brandywine or Red Clay Creek or something, would be pretty infrequent on the roads. And those people may have been more cautious. So does this experience actually make you worse off? Asan Azuzaman is from Bangladesh, and he says, I'm used to driving through flooded waters all the time, right? He's got lots of experience in his homeland about doing that, because it's a common experience. But yes, that's a key thing. What we wanted to do, and we've been talking with DelDOT, is to actually record it and record the license plates to see, are these people who consistently do this road over and over again, or are these kind of one-time people who are new to this coastal road when it's flooded out, and track those things. Because I think it was a really good point of the heterogeneity of behavior that we might be seeing based on their own experience.
Kent, I have another question. I hate to be, but this is on the project with the chicken manure, and maybe you may not be able to answer it, but someone on the team can. This is just for my knowledge, because with chicken manure, I'm pretty sure that you can't just apply chicken manure to all plants, because some of them will burn. So I'm not sure. When this survey was done. Are you planning, when you're talking about chicken manure, is it provided directly? I can't believe, because some plants I suspect will burn if you apply it directly. So there has to be something done to it before it can be applied. And, maybe, if you can answer it, if someone else can answer it, that would be great.
Rachel, this is your slide. Can you speak on that? If not, we'll let someone else know on talk on it.
I can. Can you repeat the question for me?
So chicken manure, I don't think can be directly applied to all plants, because I suspect some of them will burn. Now, I'm not an ag person, so I have no clue, but I'm a chemist. And, maybe someone knows that answer.
Yeah, so chicken litter can't be applied everywhere. It has to meet certain requirements, and it can burn. Actually, a couple years ago, in a storage facility down in Sussex County, one's combusted because it wasn't stored properly. But on the field, it's normally mixed in with other components of like chicken, so it's not just the litter, it's also like dead birds that were taken from houses and mixed in, so it's not just the manure, it's like a co-product of sorts to help alleviate those issues.
Yeah, maybe I was not clear. So I'm talking about, you're actually burning the plant itself. I don't know how to explain it, but you can kill the plant essentially if you apply it directly. At least that's what I think, but I could be wrong. So something has to be done to the chicken litter, before it can be applied to the plant. I suspect at least some plants.
Yeah, I would assume, I can't answer specifically for all plants, but I know at least here in southern Delaware, we mostly focus on corn and soybeans. So I couldn't tell you if it burns the plant directly, because normally the way they apply it is it's to like a more fallow field, and it's like tilled or not into the land, because it comes back to dissolving into the soil for the nutrients versus applying directly onto the crops.
Okay.
Nice job, Rachel. I don't think I could have done a better job. I think you're right. I think there is some mixing there, and there's some treatment there, whether that's using the crop fields or the growing mushrooms up north and so forth. I think Malcolm, your chemistry will no doubt have a good point that we have to be careful about how we treat it and how it's mixed.
Hey, Kent. George here.
Hey, George.
How you doing? So I think it would be I'm kind of curious about the possibility of a benefit cost analysis of this signage. It's a super cheap thing to do. You sort of have to have some kind of sign up, and but as you shift around the different signs, you get these different behavioral outcomes, and so the benefits can swing all around. But surely some kind, if you save one life every 5 or 6 years, it's, or even every 10 years, probably, it's worthwhile. But then I think there are also inconveniences created, or there's, the information can get interpreted incorrectly. And so anyway, I'm just going to toss that out there. I think it could be something could be done in a simple essay of a benefit cost analysis.
Yeah, well, George, it's a good point, right? Because not only are we saving lives, but if this is coastal water with a lot of high salinity, might be also damaging cars that are
property.
Beyond that property. Yeah, so there could be a lot of different features there. One thing that we've realized is that there's when talking about there's not a lot of flexibility on road signages. They're set by federal standards. And they aren't state by state, which makes sense, right? We don't really want to go to Maryland and suddenly find that they've got whole new ways of showing it. There are certain areas of doing it, like having active flashing. So when there's water on the road, there could be active flashing versus not active. And there's, different types of signs in terms of how luminescent they are and things like that. So
there's also like the possibility of apps that people that live in flooded areas could have some kind of app to signal them, and so forth. But yeah, you're right.
Yeah. That's a good one. I know. Dan. I think Dan Leathers is on here, but they've been working on a flooding app that tracks your house. So if you're suddenly, you got your coastal beach home, or something along the inland bays, you can actually begin to say, okay, here's the storm, here's the current water levels, this is how far we think that the water level would get to your house, and I don't know if it goes to the streets or not on your kind of common paths to cross or not. But I don't know, Dan or Tina, can you speak on that and whether it actually, the app you developed looks at roads as well as properties?
Yeah, the coastal flood monitoring system definitely looks at evacuation routes, and you can use the Google interface to get down to individual streets or even individual houses. We also made an effort to make that available for cell phones, so for very, very mobile devices. The idea is that the emergency managers could then go out and show people what the projected flooding map looked like, and from that try to get them to make the appropriate decisions. So yeah, the big thing is, I guess, and I agree with you, George, I think that all the suggestions you made are great. When it comes to apps and stuff, then you have the problem of getting people to use them and training them of how to use them, etc. And that's where a lot of the big issues come in, that engagement and really getting people to use what you put together for them.
Which also could be studied as well, right? Like, what kind of things gets the use higher and so forth. It just strikes me as kind of an interesting area where you have all this array of very low cost things, right? That are information provision that have the potential for big benefits, and and some are going to be more effective than others. And how does a policymaker choose across that array using evidence-based science and policy and analysis, like Kent was saying? But anyway.
The other thing that's going on right now is SEMA has been involved with some folks from engineering and some other folks to develop low-cost flood sensors for roadways around the state. And that would be something that could and would probably have to be adapted into some type of app, which would tell people, just that this section of the road is covered by water, and so you're going to have to make a decision of how you want to deal with that. And that could be potentially statewide, not just along the coast and in places that are typically flood. And so Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. The really important thing is to get people to use all this information in a sensible way, and that's where we defer to, you and Kent and Lee and all the other people that work on those types of issues.
Oh, so you're going to punt, huh?
Yep.
Well,
No.
what I suggest too, if you're talking about low cost, is if you could get Google to incorporate this information into Google Maps, and so you get a little alert. Then the cost is so low,
Mhm.
and having people see that as a value,
Right, and the other place this information, if these sensors are eventually deployed, will be the DelDOT app, which DelDOT already has an app to show road closures and so on, and so would go on that. But you're right, the one thing that we've found is just how important this idea is of making sure that what we're building as scientists are actually being used by the community in a meaningful way. And that's what kind of makes WiCCED interesting, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, we had this really serious major storm in Wilmington. I don't know, what was it, a month ago or so or something? It was really incredible. The trees that came down, and the power lines that were down, and people were stranded for hours. And my daughter was one of them. She'd just gone out for a short trip, and she was stranded here in kind of in the Wilmington area, and there were there was the cables coming across the highway, and she's like in her 20s, so she was all over her phone trying to figure out what to do, and there wasn't much she couldn't know where. It didn't help her. So, but it would have been interesting at that point for if we had something to go to at that point to direct her how to get out of where she was and so forth. Anyway, just that was probably an unnecessary anecdote.
Well, and I'll add one other unnecessary anecdote to that too, is that two of our stations up there that day had 1,000-year 5-minute precipitation events.
Oh my
Something
word!
they expect once in 1,000 years. So that was
Yeah.
quite an extreme event. But those are the types of events that really affect people.
Yeah,
We need to do a better job of somehow addressing.
yeah, cool. Thanks for doing this, Kent.